I didn't mean to ruin my life in front of the entire school, but apparently all it took was one sentence, one laugh, and one guy who shouldn't have been looking at me in the first place. The worst part wasn't even what they said. It was that they were right. I didn't belong there. Not in the center of the gym with the banners hanging overhead and the smell of polished wood and sweat in the air. Not with people who looked like they had their lives figured out before graduation, and definitely not standing 3 feet away from Blake Carter, captain of the basketball team. 6'3" of effortless confidence, and the kind of presence that made people straighten up without realizing it. And I swear I wasn't staring at him. I wasn't. I was just trying not to look at the group of guys behind me who were laughing a little too loud, a little too deliberately, like they wanted me to hear every word, like they needed me to hear it. Dude, who even let him in here? One of them said, and another snorted. Maybe he got lost on the way to the art club, and I told myself to ignore it, just walk, just breathe, just get out. But my feet wouldn't move. They never do when I need them to, and my hands felt weird, like I didn't know where to put them. Pockets too obvious, arms too stiff, everything about me suddenly wrong in a way that made my chest feel tight, like the room was shrinking inch by inch. And then someone bumped my shoulder, not hard, not enough to call it anything, just enough to make it clear I was in the way, always in the way, and I laughed, because what else do you do when you're the punchline, right? You laugh like you're in on it, like it doesn't sting, like it doesn't stick under your skin and stay there. And I almost made it out. I really did. I turned toward the exit, already imagining the quiet of the hallway, the relief of not being seen, when a voice cut through everything, sharp and careless. Hey, isn't that the guy who got rejected last week? And the laughter hit harder this time, louder, closer, and my stomach dropped because yeah, that was me, of course it was me, the guy who asked the wrong person at the wrong time, in the most public way possible, because apparently I specialize in bad decisions, and I could feel it again, that heat creeping up my neck, that urge to disappear, to rewind, to be anyone else, anywhere else. And I told myself, just keep walking, don't react, don't give them anything. But then it happened, fast and sudden and completely, unbelievably not real. A hand closed around my wrist, warm and firm, stopping me mid-step, and for a second my brain just blanked, because nobody touches me like that. Not here, not ever. And I turned, slow, confused, already bracing for something worse. But it wasn't worse. It was him, Blake Carter, standing way too close, closer than made sense, his fingers still wrapped around my wrist like it belonged there, like I belonged there. And my first thought, stupid and useless, was that he smelled like clean laundry and something sharp, like winter air, and my second thought was that this had to be a joke. It had to be, because people like him don't just grab people like me, not unless there's a reason, not unless there's an audience. And oh, there was definitely an audience. The gym had gone quieter, not silent, but enough that I could feel the shift, the attention tilting toward us, toward me. And I tried to pull back. Instinct, panic, everything screaming wrong, wrong, wrong. But his grip tightened just slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to say don't. And then he leaned in, just enough that I could hear him over the noise, his voice low, steady, like this was nothing, like this was normal. Stay, he said, and my heart did something weird, something fast and uncoordinated. And before I could ask what he was doing, before I could even process why he was still touching me, he straightened, turned his head toward the guys behind me, the ones still watching, still waiting, and smiled. Not the friendly kind, not the easy kind, but the kind that meant he knew exactly what he was doing. And then he said it, clear enough for everyone to hear, like he wanted them to hear it, like he wanted the entire room to hear it. He's my boyfriend. And just like that, everything tilted, the laughter died, the air changed, and I forgot how to breathe because there was no way, absolutely no way, that Blake Carter was talking about me. For a second, nobody moved, like the entire gym had forgotten how to function, and I could feel it, every pair of eyes snapping toward us, locking on me like I had suddenly become something worth noticing, which made absolutely no sense because 5 seconds ago I was invisible, I was background noise, I was the guy people talked over. And now I was standing there with Blake Carter's hand still wrapped around my wrist, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like this had always been the plan. And my brain kept repeating the same word over and over. Fake, fake, fake. Except it did not feel fake. Not with how close he was. Not with how steady his grip felt. not with how his thumb shifted just slightly against my skin like he was grounding me instead of trapping me. And that made it worse, because I did not know how to react to something that felt real, but could not possibly be real. And someone behind us finally spoke. Hesitant, confused. Wait, what? And the tension cracked. Just enough for sound to rush back in. Whispers spreading like wildfire, phones lifting, people leaning closer, and I felt my pulse spike because this was not a small moment anymore. This was a scene. This was something that would not stay inside these walls, and I tried again to pull my hand free, a little harder this time. But Blake did not let go. He just glanced down at me briefly, quick and unreadable, and then back up like I was not the important part of this equation, like the audience mattered more, like this was all for them. And maybe it was. Maybe I was just a prop in whatever game he was playing. And that thought should have made it easier to breathe, but it did not. It just made my chest feel tight in a different way. Because if this was a game, then I did not know the rules, and I was very aware that I was losing. Is that a problem? Blake said, his voice calm, almost bored, and the guys who had been laughing earlier suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear, which was new. I had never seen that before, people backing off because of something connected to me, because of me, and it felt strange, wrong, like wearing someone else's jacket that fit too well to be comfortable, and one of them muttered something about not knowing, about just joking, and Blake shrugged, casual, like none of this mattered, like he had not just flipped the entire narrative in under 10 seconds, and then, just when I thought it might end there, that he would let go and walk away, and this would all dissolve into confusion and rumors. He did something worse, something quieter, something that made my stomach drop in a completely different way. He stepped closer, closing the gap until there was barely any space left between us, and his hand shifted from my wrist to my sleeve, fingers brushing the fabric like it was nothing, like he had every right, and I could feel the heat rise again, sharper this time, because this was not for them anymore. This was too subtle, too close, and he leaned just enough that only I could hear him, his voice low and steady and completely unfair. Relax, he said, like I was the one overreacting, like I was the problem here. And I wanted to laugh. I wanted to say something sarcastic, something that would break whatever this was, but my voice did not cooperate. It just stayed stuck somewhere behind my ribs. And all I could think was that this was spiraling way too fast, way too far, and I had no idea how to stop it. And then he straightened again, louder now, back to that public tone like flipping a switch. We are leaving, he said, not asking, not explaining, just stating it like a fact. And before I could process that either, he was already guiding me forward, not pulling, not dragging, just moving like he expected me to follow. Like this was something I would agree to without question, and the worst part was that I did. My feet moving automatically, my brain still trying to catch up, because walking away with him felt easier than staying and facing everything he had just started, easier than turning back into the version of myself that people laughed at. And as we pushed through the gym doors into the hallway, the noise dimming behind us, I finally found enough breath to speak, my voice coming out quieter than I wanted. What are you doing? And he did not answer right away, just kept walking for a few steps like he was thinking about it, like the question actually required effort. And then he glanced at me, brief and unreadable again, and said, fixing a problem, like that explained anything, like I was supposed to understand. And I stopped walking, because no, that was not enough. Say that and walk away, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, which was something at least, something small to hold on to. And he tilted his head slightly, like he was reassessing me, like I had just done something mildly unexpected. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching in that uncomfortable way where you can hear your own heartbeat, too loud, too fast. And then he sighed, not annoyed exactly, but not patient either, like this was taking longer than he wanted. Look, he said, and his tone shifted, less public, less performative, more direct. There is a situation, and I almost laughed, because of course there was. There is always a situation with people like him. Something complicated and layered and completely outside of anything normal. And I crossed my arms, more for something to do than anything else. A situation that involves lying about dating someone you have never spoken to before? I asked, and that should have sounded ridiculous. It should have made him backtrack, but it did not. If anything, it made his expression settle into something more certain, like this confirmed whatever he had already decided. And that was when I realized the worst part of all of this. He was not improvising. Not really. He had chosen me. Not randomly. Not by accident. He had seen me and decided. And that thought hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant this was not chaos. This was intentional. And I did not know if that made it better or worse. Probably worse. Definitely worse. It does not have to be complicated. He continued, like he was explaining something simple, like we were discussing a group project instead of my entire social existence imploding. We just go along with it for a while. And there it was, the part that made my chest tighten again, because that word, we, did not belong here. It did not fit. It sounded too easy, too shared, and I shook my head. Again, softer this time, more disbelief than anger. You mean I go along with it? I said, because let us be honest, he would be fine no matter what. He always would be. People like him do not fall. They adjust, they land on their feet. And people like me do not. And he watched me for a second, really watched me this time, like he was trying to calculate something, like he was weighing options. And then he stepped closer again, not as sudden as before, not as overwhelming, but still enough to make me hyper-aware of everything. The space between us, the way his presence filled it without trying, and his voice dropped slightly, not a whisper, but close enough that it felt like one. I will handle the rest, he said, and there was something in it, something steady, something that sounded like certainty instead of assumption, and I hated that it worked. Even a little, I hated that part of me wanted to believe him, because believing him would make this easier. It would give this structure, rules, something to follow instead of just chaos, and I pressed my lips together, trying to push that thought away, trying to stay grounded in reality, because reality was that this was fake, this was temporary, this was a bad idea dressed up as a solution, and I needed to say no, I needed to walk away, I needed to choose myself for once, and I opened my mouth to do exactly that, to shut this down before it got worse, before it got deeper, before it turned into something I could not untangle later. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket, sharp and sudden, breaking the moment, and I knew before I even looked that it was already too late, because nothing spreads faster than a story people want to believe, and I pulled it out anyway, because of course I did. Because I needed to see how bad it was, and the screen lit up with notifications, one after another, messages, tags, mentions, and at the top, a video thumbnail frozen on a frame I recognized instantly, his hand on my wrist, my face turned toward him. The exact second everything changed, and the caption underneath it read in bold, unmistakable text, "Basketball captain finally confirms his boyfriend." And my heart dropped straight through the floor, because this was not just a rumor anymore. This was real to them, completely, undeniably real, and I looked up at him, something between panic and disbelief tightening in my chest. You said this would not be complicated, I said, quieter now because it already was. It already had been from the second he grabbed my hand. And he did not look surprised, not even a little, just glanced at the screen and then back at me like this was expected, like this was part of the plan. And then he said, calm as ever, "It is not, if you trust me." And that was the problem, because I did not even close. But somehow I was already standing in the middle of something that required me to trust me. He said it like it was simple, like trust was something you could just decide to have on command, like flipping a switch, and I stared at him for a second too long, because I did not know whether to laugh or walk away, or just stand there until this entire situation somehow reversed itself, which it obviously was not going to do, because my phone kept buzzing in my hand, relentless, like it was determined to prove that this was real, that this was happening whether I wanted it to or not. And I could feel it again, that pressure building in my chest, that sense of being pushed into something with no clear exit, and I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, trying to think, because panicking was not going to fix this. Panicking never fixes anything. And he was still watching me, calm, patient in a way that felt almost unfair, like he had all the time in the world while I was already running out of it. And I looked down at my phone again, scrolling just enough to see how bad it had gotten. Comments stacking up under the video, people speculating, guessing, acting like they had known all along, like this was some hidden truth finally revealed. And I almost scoffed at that, because if there was one thing people had never done, it was pay attention to me. And now suddenly they had opinions, theories, expectations, and I swallowed hard, because that word stuck more than the others, expectations, because that meant this was not just a moment, this was something I would have to keep up, something I would have to maintain. And I looked back at him, sharper this time, more focused. For how long? I asked, because if this was going to happen, if this was already happening, then I needed to understand the scope of the damage, and he did not hesitate, which somehow made it worse. "A few weeks," he said, like it was nothing. Like a few weeks was not an eternity when you were pretending to be someone else, when you were being seen in a way that was not real. And I let out a quiet breath, running a hand through my hair, because this was spiraling again, faster this time. And then what? I pressed, because there had to be an end. There had to be a point where this stopped, where things went back to normal, even if normal meant going back to being invisible. And he shrugged slightly, casual, almost dismissive. "Then we say it did not work out," he said, and that should have reassured me. It should have sounded like an exit plan, but instead it just made something twist uncomfortably in my chest, because the way he said it, the ease of it, made it sound like this was disposable. Like I was disposable, like this entire thing could just be picked up and put down without consequence. And maybe it could for him, but not for me. Not when I was the one who would have to deal with whatever came after, the whispers, the looks, the inevitable shift from curiosity to judgment. And I tightened my grip on my phone slightly, grounding myself, reminding myself that I still had a choice, even if it did not feel like it. And I met his gaze again, steady this time, forcing myself not to look away. "Why me?" I asked, because that was the part that did not make sense. That was the part that kept bothering me. And for the first time since this started, he paused, just for a second, like the question had actually landed somewhere, like it was not something he could brush off with a simple answer. And I saw it then, that flicker of something different in his expression, something that did not match the calm, controlled version he had been showing me so far, and it was gone almost immediately, replaced by that same composed look. But it was enough to make my chest tighten again, because it meant there was more to this than he was saying, more than he was willing to explain. And he glanced away briefly, down the hallway, like he was checking something, like he was buying time, and then back at me. "Because you were there," he said, and that was it. That was his answer, simple, clean, completely unsatisfying, and I almost laughed again, because of course it was not that simple. Of course there was a reason he was not saying, and I should have pushed, I should have demanded more, but my phone buzzed again, louder this time in the quiet hallway, and before I could stop myself, I looked down, and this time it was not just notifications, it was a message, a direct one, from a number I did not have saved, and the preview alone made my stomach drop. "If this is real, we need to talk." And I did not need to ask who it was, I did not need to guess, because there was only one person who would send something like that, only one person who would care enough to question it. And I felt the shift again, the situation tilting into something more complicated, more tangled, and I looked back up at him, my pulse picking up for an entirely new reason. "Your situation," I said quietly, holding up my phone just enough for him to understand without seeing the screen. "Does it have anything to do with this?" And his expression changed, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that I knew I had hit something real, something important. And for the first time since this started, he did not answer right away. He did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything he could have come up with, because it confirmed what I already suspected. This was not random. This was not just some impulsive decision in the middle of a crowded gym. This was connected to something real, something messy enough that he needed a solution fast. And somehow I had become that solution, and I felt it again. That uncomfortable mix of frustration and something else I did not want to name, because part of me wanted to understand. Part of me wanted to know what kind of situation made someone like him do something like this. And that was dangerous. Getting curious meant getting involved, and I should not want that. I should not want anything to do with this. And yet I was still standing here, still waiting, still giving him time to respond instead of walking away like I should have. And he finally exhaled, slow, like he was deciding how much to say, how much to let me see. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not weak, just more controlled, more careful. "It helps," he said, and I blinked, because that was not an explanation, not really. It was just enough to confirm that yes, this was connected. Yes, this mattered. But no, he was not going to hand me the full story, and I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, shaking my head slightly because of course it was like this. Of course nothing about this was going to be straightforward, and I glanced down at my phone again, at that message still sitting there, waiting, heavy in a way that made it hard to ignore, and I could feel the situation tightening around me, pulling me in from multiple directions at once, him on one side with his calm, controlled plan, and whatever this was on the other side, something more personal, more complicated, and I pressed my lips together, trying to think, trying to stay grounded in something that made sense. This is a bad idea, I said finally, quieter now, less defensive, more honest, because it really was, and he did not disagree, which surprised me more than anything else. He just nodded once, like he had already accepted that, like that part did not matter. Probably, he said, and there was something almost dry in his tone, like he understood exactly how bad this could get and had decided to do it anyway. And that should have been a red flag, a very obvious one. But instead it just made me pause, because people do not usually walk into bad ideas unless they think the alternative is worse, and that thought lingered longer than I wanted it to. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, past the confidence, past the control, and there was something there, something quieter, something I had not noticed before, because everything had been moving too fast, and it was gone almost as quickly as I saw it, replaced by that same composed expression. But it was enough to make my chest tighten in a different way, less panic, more awareness, and I hated that shift. I hated that I was starting to see him as more than just the problem, because that made this harder, that made saying no harder, and my phone buzzed again, sharp and insistent, dragging me back, reminding me that this was not just about him, not just about whatever he was dealing with. This was about me too, about what this would do to my life, my already fragile place in it, and I straightened slightly, forcing myself to focus. If I say yes, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully. This does not just go away for me after a few weeks. And he did not interrupt, did not brush it off, just listened, which somehow made it easier to keep going. People will remember, they will talk, they will expect things, and when it ends, they will have opinions about that too. And I hated how clear it sounded when I said it out loud, how real it became, and he nodded again, slower this time, like he was actually considering it, like he had not just assumed I would go along with whatever he said, and that helped, a little, not enough, but enough that I did not feel completely ignored. And then he stepped closer again, not invading, just closing the distance enough that I could hear him without the hallway swallowing his voice. I will make sure it does not hurt you, he said, and there it was again, that certainty, that confidence, like he believed he could control the outcome, like he could manage people, situations, narratives, and part of me wanted to believe that, because believing that would make this easier, it would give me something solid to hold on to, and part of me knew that people are not that simple, that you cannot control what everyone thinks, what everyone says, what everyone decides to believe, and I hesitated, caught between those two thoughts, between the safer choice and the easier one. And I looked down at my phone one more time, at the message waiting, at the chaos already unfolding, and I realized something that made my stomach twist. Whether I said yes or no, this was not going away, not completely, not anymore. And when I looked back up at him, my voice was quieter, steadier in a way that felt strange. Then you explain everything, I said. Because if I was going to step into this, if I was going to let this happen, I was not doing it blind, and for a second, just a second, he looked almost surprised, like he had not expected that condition. And then something shifted in his expression, something closer to respect than anything I had seen from him so far. And he nodded once, firm this time. Fine, he said, and just like that, it felt like a line had been crossed, like something had been agreed to without fully understanding what it would cost. And I was not sure if that made me relieved or more anxious, probably both, definitely both. Fine, he said it like it was a simple agreement, like we had just settled on something normal, something manageable. But the moment that word landed, I felt it, that shift, like the ground under this entire situation had locked into place, and there was no easy way to step back anymore. And for a second neither of us moved, just standing there in the hallway with everything still buzzing in the background, my phone still lighting up in my hand, his presence still too close, too steady, and I realized I had no idea what came next, no script, no instructions, nothing to tell me how to act in a situation that should not exist in the first place. And maybe he noticed that. Maybe he saw the hesitation because his expression softened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to catch, but enough that I did, and he reached out again, slower this time, deliberate, his fingers brushing lightly against my sleeve before settling there, not grabbing, not forcing, just there, and it should have felt easier because of that, less overwhelming. But it did not. It just made everything more confusing, because this was not how fake was supposed to feel. Fake should be obvious, clear, something you can separate from reality without thinking, and this was not that. Not with how careful he was being, not with how aware I suddenly was of every small movement, every inch of space between us, and I swallowed, trying to push that thought away, trying to focus on something practical, something I could control. So what exactly do I have to do? I asked, because if this was happening, if I had just agreed to something I probably should not have, then I needed rules, boundaries, something to keep this from spiraling even further out of control, and he nodded slightly, like he had been expecting that question, like he had already thought this through, which of course he had, and he stepped back just enough to give me space, enough that I could breathe a little easier, even if my chest still felt tight. Nothing complicated, he said, and I almost rolled my eyes because everything about this was already complicated, but I stayed quiet, letting him continue. We just act normal, and I let out a short breath, because that was not helpful, that was not even close to helpful. Normal for who? I asked, and this time he did almost smile, just a small shift at the corner of his mouth, like he appreciated the question, like he understood the problem even if he was pretending it was simple, for them. He said, and that made sense in a way I did not like, because it meant this was not about what felt real or comfortable. It was about what looked convincing, what people expected to see, and I nodded slowly, processing that, even if I did not like it. So we pretend, I said, more to myself than to him. And he shook his head slightly, quick, almost automatic. We do not overthink it, he corrected, and there was something in his tone that made me pause, something that suggested that thinking too much would make this harder, would make it obvious, and I hated that he was probably right, and I glanced down at my phone again, at the flood of attention that had not slowed even a little, and I felt that same pressure building again, pushing me forward, pushing me into this, whether I was ready or not. And when I looked back up, he was watching me, waiting, not pushing, just there, and for some reason that made it easier to nod, just once, small, barely noticeable, but enough. And he seemed to take that as confirmation, because his posture shifted, more relaxed, more certain, like something had settled into place for him. And then he did something that caught me completely off guard, something small, but somehow more impactful than everything else so far. He reached out and adjusted the collar of my shirt, quick and casual, like it was nothing, like it was something he had done 100 times before, and my breath caught for a second because it was too close, too familiar, and I froze, completely, my brain scrambling to catch up, and he did not react to that, did not comment, just stepped back again like nothing had happened, like that had been part of the plan, and maybe it was. Maybe this was how it started, small things, subtle things, things that blurred the line just enough that no one would question it, and I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself again, trying to hold on to something solid in the middle of all this. And that was when I heard it, footsteps echoing down the hallway, voices getting closer, louder, and I tensed automatically, instinct kicking in before logic could catch up, because this was it. This was the moment where pretending stopped being theoretical and started being real, and I glanced at him, quick, uncertain, and he met my gaze, calm as ever, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. And then he reached for my hand again, not sudden, not forceful, just steady, and I hesitated for half a second before letting it happen, before letting my fingers settle into his, because walking away now would only make everything worse. And as the voices turned the corner and eyes landed on us again, I realized there was no going back to before this. Not anymore. The moment their eyes landed on us, I felt it again, that sharp shift in the air, like everything had narrowed down to this one point, this one image, and suddenly it was not just a rumor anymore. It was confirmation, something solid they could see with their own eyes, and my hand tightened instinctively in his before I could stop myself, because this was real now, at least to them, completely and undeniably real, and I could feel the way people slowed down as they passed, the way conversations dipped just slightly, like no one wanted to be obvious, but no one could help looking either. And I focused on something small, something manageable, like the steady warmth of his hand against mine, because if I thought about anything else, I was going to overthink it. I was going to panic, and I remembered what he said, do not overthink it, just act normal. Except I had no idea what normal looked like in this situation, so I did the only thing I could. I stayed close, I matched his pace, I let him lead, and somehow that seemed to work, because no one questioned it, no one stopped us, they just watched, whispered, reacted in ways that felt distant and too close at the same time. And we kept walking like this was routine, like this was something we had been doing for a while instead of something that had started less than an hour ago. And it was strange how quickly that illusion built, how easily it settled into place, like people wanted to believe it, like they were filling in the gaps themselves. And that made it easier and harder all at once. Easier because we did not have to force it. Harder because it meant this was spreading beyond our control, and we turned a corner, away from the main hallway, into a quieter stretch where the noise faded again, where it was just us and the echo of our steps and the faint hum of the building around us. And I exhaled slowly, tension slipping just enough that I could think again, and I realized my hand was still in his, fingers still loosely intertwined like it belonged there. And that realization hit a second too late, because now pulling away would look deliberate, it would look wrong. So I hesitated, caught in that split second of indecision, and he noticed, of course he did, his thumb shifting slightly against my hand in a small, grounding motion that should not have felt as steady as it did, and I swallowed, trying to ignore the way that small movement lingered, trying to focus on anything else. This is already working too well, I muttered, half to myself, because it really was, and that should have been reassuring, but instead it just made me uneasy, because things that work too well usually come with consequences later, and he let out a quiet breath beside me. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, just something in between. That is the point, he said, and I glanced at him, because of course it was, of course he had planned it this way. And I wanted to ask more. I wanted to push, to understand exactly what he was dealing with, what this was supposed to fix, but my phone buzzed again, sharp and insistent, and I almost ignored it this time. Almost, but something made me look, something told me this was different, and when I checked the screen, my chest tightened again, because it was another message, same number, same urgency, but this time it was shorter, more direct. Answer me. And I felt that tension return, sharper. Now, pulling me in a different direction, because whatever this situation was, it was not just happening here, it was extending outward, reaching into places I had not prepared for, and I stopped walking without realizing it, my focus shifting completely, and he slowed immediately, turning slightly toward me, his attention sharp, aware. What is it? He asked, and I hesitated, because I was not sure how much to share, not sure how much of this I wanted him involved in. But then again, he was already involved, more than anyone else, and I held up my phone just enough for him to understand, my voice quieter than before. Whoever this is, they are not buying it, I said, and for a second, something changed in his expression, not panic, not worry, but something more focused, more serious, like this was the part that actually mattered. And he reached out, not for my hand this time, but for the phone, stopping just short, like he was asking without saying it, and I hesitated again before letting him see, because at this point, there was no point hiding it, not when I was already standing in the middle of everything he had started, and as he read the message, his jaw tightened just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough that I caught it, enough that I knew this was not just random, this was connected, directly, and when he looked back at me, there was something different in his gaze now, something more urgent, more certain. We need to make this look real, he said, and my stomach dropped, because I thought we already were. I thought that was the entire point, and before I could ask what he meant, he stepped closer again, closing the space between us in a way that felt intentional. Deliberate, like the next move had already been decided, and I had a split second to wonder what that meant before everything shifted again. Before I could ask what he meant, he was already moving. Not rushed, not reckless, just deliberate in a way that made my pulse spike, because this was different from before. This was not just holding hands or standing close. This felt like a line we had not crossed yet, and I barely had time to process that before his hand came up, fingers brushing lightly against the side of my neck, not gripping, not forcing, just there, steady, grounding in a way that made my thoughts scatter instead of settle, and my breath caught because it was too close, too personal, and my first instinct was to step back, to put space between us, but I froze instead, caught in that split second where my brain could not decide if this was still part of the act or something else entirely, and he leaned in just enough that from the outside, from anyone watching, it would look natural, like something effortless, something familiar, and I hated how easily that illusion formed, how convincing it probably looked, and my heart was beating too fast, too loud, like it was trying to give me away, like it knew I was out of my depth, and I focused on breathing, slow, steady, trying to keep it together because this was what we agreed to. This was the part where we made it real, and his voice dropped just slightly, low enough that only I could hear. Do not react, he said, calm, controlled, like he already knew I was about to. Like he could read every hesitation before it happened, and that should have annoyed me. It should have made me pull away, but instead it grounded me just enough to stay still, to hold the moment without breaking it. And I could feel the shift again, not just between us but around us. The subtle change in the air that meant someone was watching, someone close enough to notice the details, and I realized this was not random. This was targeted. This was for whoever had sent those messages, whoever was not convinced yet. And that thought made everything sharper, more intentional. And then his thumb moved slightly, just a small motion against my skin, and my brain short-circuited for a second because it felt real in a way that was hard to ignore, and I swallowed, trying to stay focused, trying to remember that this was still fake, still temporary, still something we would walk away from eventually. And then he pulled back just enough to look at me, not breaking the illusion, not stepping out of character, just adjusting the distance like it was natural, like it belonged. And there was something in his expression I had not seen before. Something softer, less controlled, like for a second he had forgotten this was supposed to be an act too. And it was gone almost immediately, replaced by that same calm certainty. But it lingered just long enough to make my chest tighten, and I hated that. I hated how easy it was to get pulled into that, to start reading into things that probably meant nothing, and I forced myself to look away, to focus on something else, anything else. And that was when I noticed it, the figure at the end of the hallway, standing just far enough to not be obvious, but close enough to see everything. And something about the way they were watching made it clear. This was not casual curiosity. This was personal. This was the person behind the messages, and my stomach dropped because this was bigger than I thought, more complicated than I was ready for, and I felt his hand shift slightly, not leaving, just adjusting like he had noticed too, like he was aware of exactly what was happening without needing to look, and that should not have surprised me at this point, but it still did, and I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself again, trying to stay present in the moment instead of spiraling into what this meant long term, and I glanced at him briefly, unsure, questioning without words, and he gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but enough to say trust this, trust me, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before letting myself lean into it, just slightly, not enough to feel unnatural, just enough to make it believable, and the moment stretched, held, like everything was balanced on this one point, and then the figure at the end of the hallway turned and walked away, not rushing, not reacting, just leaving like they had seen enough. And I felt something shift again, the tension easing just slightly, like the immediate threat had passed, and I pulled back instinctively this time, needing space, needing to breathe, and I looked at him, my voice quieter than before, edged with something I could not quite name. Was that them? I asked, because it had to be, it had to connect, and he watched the empty space where the figure had been for a second before answering, his tone steady but different now, more serious than anything he had shown so far. Yes, he said, and that single word made everything feel heavier, more real, because whatever this situation was, it was not over, not even close. Yes, he said, and it should have been a simple answer, just one word, but it carried weight, something heavy and unresolved, like this was not just about rumors or reputation or whatever story he had built around us. This was about a person, someone real, someone who cared enough to question it, to watch, to wait. And suddenly the hallway felt smaller, like the walls had closed in just a little, like everything had narrowed down to a point I could not step away from anymore. And I ran a hand through my hair, trying to steady myself, trying to think past the immediate rush of everything that had just happened, because this was no longer hypothetical. This was no longer something we could undo quietly. This was out there now, confirmed, seen, and whatever came next was going to build on that, not erase it. And I looked at him. Really looked this time, searching for something that made sense, something that explained why this mattered so much, why he had chosen this instead of any other solution, and for a second, just a second, I saw it again, that flicker of something beneath the surface, something less controlled, less calculated, like this was not as easy for him as he made it seem, and that realization shifted something in me, not enough to make me comfortable, not enough to make this okay, but enough that I could not ignore it anymore. And I exhaled slowly, my voice quieter now, more grounded. So what now? I asked, because that was the only question that mattered at this point. Not how we got here, not why, but what we were supposed to do next, and he did not answer right away, just watched the empty hallway where that person had disappeared, like he was thinking ahead, like he was already mapping out the next move. And then he turned back to me, his expression settling into something firm, something certain. "Now we stay consistent," he said, and I nodded slowly. Because that made sense, even if I did not like it. Consistency meant control. It meant the story held. It meant fewer cracks for people to question, and I glanced down at my phone again, at the messages still waiting, at the notifications that had not slowed down at all, and I realized something that made my chest tighten in a different way. This was not just his situation anymore. It was mine too, whether I wanted it to be or not, and that thought lingered, heavier than everything else, because it meant I had a role in this now, not just a part to play, but a position to hold, and I was not sure I was ready for that. Not sure I had ever been ready for anything like this. And yet here I was, standing in the middle of it, already too far in to step back without consequences, and I looked up at him again, steadier this time, less reactive, more aware of what I was stepping into. "Then you do not leave me guessing," I said, because if this was going to work, if this was going to last even a few weeks, I needed more than vague answers and half explanations. I needed clarity. Something solid to hold on to when everything else felt unstable, and he held my gaze for a moment, like he was measuring that, like he was deciding whether I had earned that much, and then he nodded once, firm, no hesitation this time. "I will tell you everything," he said, and there was something different in the way he said it, something that sounded less like a promise and more like a decision, like he had already accepted that this was no longer something he could handle alone, and that should have reassured me. It should have made this feel more balanced, but instead it just made me more aware of how much I did not know, how much I was about to be pulled into, and I took a breath, slow, steady, trying to center myself before this went any further, because this was the point where things shifted from accidental to intentional, from reaction to choice, and I realized something that made my stomach twist slightly. This was not just about pretending anymore, not entirely, not when there were real people involved, real consequences, real emotions waiting just beneath the surface, and I glanced down the hallway one more time, at the space where that person had been, and then back at him, and for the first time since all of this started, I felt something close to certainty settle in, not comfort, not confidence, but clarity, and I nodded once, small but deliberate, because whether I liked it or not, this was happening, and walking away now would not undo it. It would just make it messier, harder, worse. And as we stood there, the silence stretching between us in a way that felt less tense and more expectant, I realized this was only the beginning, not the resolution, not even close, just the moment where everything truly started, and I had no idea how it was going to end, only that it was not going to be simple, and probably not clean, but somehow, despite all of that, I stayed.